June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach. A Sherman tank named Fury takes a direct hit. The crew abandons it, scrambling for cover as German shells rain down around them. The mission is over. Except one man refuses to leave. Sergeant Curtis Culin had no engineering degree, no special training, just a crazy idea involving scrap metal and a welding torch. His commanding officer called him insane. His crewmates laughed at him. But what he built in 48 hours would change the entire invasion. One broken tank, one mad mechanic, and an invention so simple, so brilliant, that Eisenhower himself called it a godsend and ordered production of hundreds of copies immediately. This is the story they don't teach in history class, the story of how a sergeant with a blowtorch saved D-Day. Stay until the end, because what happened to him afterward would shock everyone. Normandy, France. 6 days after D-Day and the Allied advance had ground to a complete halt. Not because of German tanks, not because of artillery, but because of hedgerows. These weren't the decorative hedges you might have in your backyard. Norman hedgerows were ancient barriers, thick walls of earth and roots that had been growing for centuries. Some were 15 feet tall with root systems extending 10 feet down into the soil. They turned every single field into a natural fortress, and the Germans knew exactly how to use them. American troops were supposed to be 30 miles inland by now, but instead they were stuck, crawling forward at a pace measured in yards per day, not miles. The problem was brutal and simple. When a Sherman tank tried to push through a hedgerow, it had to climb up and over the earthen wall. The moment the tank tilted upward, its belly armor was completely exposed. And that belly armor? Paper thin compared to the front. German soldiers would just wait in position on the other side with Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns, watching for that vulnerable moment when the Sherman's underside was exposed and its main gun pointed uselessly at the sky. One shot, one burning tank, one crew that never made it home. It happened over and over, day after day. The bocage country of Normandy had become a massive killing field, and nobody had an answer. The generals were getting desperate. They tried everything. Explosives to blow gaps in the hedgerows. But that just alerted every German within half a mile to exactly where the attack was coming. Bulldozers. But they were slow, loud, and drew fire like magnets. Some units tried sending infantry through first to clear the Germans, but casualties were insane. The hedgerows stretched for miles in every direction, and at this rate, the war in France would last years, not months. Morale was collapsing. Tank crews knew that every time they approached another hedgerow, there was a good chance they wouldn't survive it. Some were refusing orders, too terrified to face that climb one more time. Command needed a solution, and they needed it yesterday. But that wasn't the whole story. Enter Sergeant Curtis Culin, a 29-year-old tanker from Cranford, New Jersey. No college education, no engineering background. Before the war, he was a liquor salesman, just a regular guy who happened to be good with his hands and loved tinkering with machinery. But Culin had something the generals didn't. He was down in the mud with the tanks, watching friends die every single day. He saw the medics carrying bodies out of burned Shermans. He heard the screams, and he refused to accept that this was just how it had to be. While officers held meetings and argued about tactics, Culin was sitting in a bombed-out barn with a pencil and paper, sketching out something that seemed absolutely crazy. His idea was simple. Don't go over the hedgerows. Go through them. But here's the part most people don't know. The part that got buried in all the publicity. Culin wasn't actually the original genius behind the idea. During one of those late-night discussions between exhausted tank crews, a soldier from Tennessee, a guy everyone called Roberts, made what everyone thought was a joke. "Why don't we just get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The group erupted in laughter. Saw teeth? On a 30-ton tank? What kind of hillbilly nonsense was that? Everyone laughed except Culin. He sat there staring at Roberts with this intense look, and then he grabbed his notebook and started sketching furiously. Roberts had just given him the answer, and nobody else had even realized it. Historians later confirmed that Culin, being an honest man, tried repeatedly to give Roberts credit for the original idea. But by then, the publicity machine had already made Culin into a national hero, and Roberts' name was forgotten. Culin presented his sketches to his commanding officer, Captain Jimmy Depew. The captain looked at the drawings and then at Culin like he'd lost his mind. 4 steel prongs welded to the front of a Sherman, designed to cut through centuries-old earth and roots. It sounded insane. But Depew had been watching his men die too, and desperate times called for desperate measures. He gave Culin 48 hours and access to whatever scrap metal he could scavenge. If it worked, Culin would be a hero. If it failed, he'd probably face a court-martial for destroying army property. Culin grabbed his welding torch and got to work. He wasn't working with fancy materials or cutting-edge technology. He was using salvaged German beach obstacles, those steel check hedgehogs that the Nazis had planted all along the coast to stop Allied tanks during the invasion. Now Culin was going to turn their own defenses against them. For 2 days straight, Culin barely slept. He worked through the nights with an acetylene torch, cutting and welding 4 massive steel prongs into a plow-like assembly. The physics behind it were actually brilliant in their simplicity. Instead of the tank climbing over the hedgerow and exposing its belly, the prongs would dig into the base of the earthen wall and essentially rip it apart from the inside. The tank's 30 tons of weight, combined with the cutting action of the steel teeth, would tear through root systems that had been growing since medieval times. At least, that was the theory. Soldiers from other units started gathering around to watch, and the betting started immediately. Half thought Culin was about to earn a medal. The other half thought he was about to get kicked out of the army for wasting time and resources on a crackpot scheme. July 14th, 1944. The moment of truth. Culin had finished welding his prototype to a Sherman tank, and word had spread fast enough that officers were showing up to watch. The test hedgerow was 12 feet tall, ancient, with roots like iron cables running through the earth. Culin's crew volunteered to be the ones inside the tank during the test, even though nobody knew if this would work or if it would just wedge the Sherman in place and make it a sitting target. The engine roared to life. The tank moved forward slowly at first, then picked up speed. When those steel prongs hit the hedgerow, the impact sounded like thunder. The entire tank shuddered violently. For a split second, nothing happened, and everyone watching held their breath. Then the roots started exploding. The earth tore apart, and the Sherman burst through the other side, frontal armor still facing forward, main gun ready to fire. The belly armor had never been exposed for even a second. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched the demonstration, and according to witnesses, he stood there in awe as the hedgerow literally exploded to make way for the Sherman. This wasn't just good. This was a game changer. Bradley immediately understood what this meant. Every Sherman in the First Army could be fitted with these devices, and suddenly the bocage wouldn't be a death trap anymore. It would just be terrain. He turned to his ordnance officers and gave an order that would change the course of the war. Produce as many of these as humanly possible, and do it fast. Within days, workshops were set up all across the beachhead. Teams of welders worked around the clock, cutting up more German beach obstacles and welding them onto Shermans. Between July 14th and July 25th, over 500 Culin hedgerow cutters were manufactured. By the time Operation Cobra launched, the big Allied breakout offensive, 60% of First Army tanks had the device fitted. Culin received the Legion of Merit for his invention, but one successful test wasn't enough. Real combat under German fire would be the true judge of whether this crazy idea would actually save lives or just get people killed. The first combat test came days later when a Sherman equipped with Culin's device, now being called the Rhinoceros, led an attack on a heavily fortified German position. The enemy had set up a machine gun nest behind a massive hedgerow, confident that the Americans would have to expose themselves trying to cross. They weren't expecting what happened next. The Rhinoceros hit the hedgerow at full speed, tearing through it like it wasn't even there. The Germans on the other side barely had time to process what was happening before the Sherman's main gun fired point blank into their position. The entire nest was destroyed before they could even react. But the real test was still coming. Intelligence reported a German Panther tank, one of the deadliest armored vehicles in the war, positioned behind another massive hedgerow and waiting in ambush. The Panther's gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor from hundreds of yards away. In a normal engagement, the Sherman wouldn't stand a chance. The Rhinoceros crew knew what they were up against, but they also knew they had an advantage the Germans didn't expect. They approached the hedgerow with the Panther waiting on the other side. The prongs bit into the earth and roots. For a heart-stopping moment, the tank's engine screamed and the treads spun, and it seemed like maybe this hedgerow was too thick. Maybe the device would fail at the worst possible moment. Then the roots gave way with a massive tearing sound, and the Sherman exploded through the hedge. The German Panther crew had been waiting for a Sherman to slowly climb over the top, where they could kill it easily. Instead, an American tank just materialized directly in front of them, with its gun already traversing toward their position. The Sherman fired first. The Panther erupted in flames. What should have been a German ambush that lasted hours turned into an American victory in under 2 minutes. A position that had held up the Allied advance for 3 days was taken in less time than it takes to make coffee. News of Culin's invention spread like wildfire through the ranks. Morale skyrocketed overnight. Tank crews who had been terrified of hedgerows were now eager to use them tactically. The Germans were completely caught off guard. Their entire defensive strategy in Normandy had been built around the bocage being impassable to armor, and suddenly, American tanks were cutting through hedgerows like they were made of paper. Between July 14th, when the first cutters were deployed, and July 25th, when Operation Cobra launched, production teams manufactured over 500 units, working in massive tents near the beaches, welding German beach obstacles onto Sherman after Sherman. By the time the big offensive began, 3 out of every 5 First Army tanks had the Culin cutter. The breakout from Normandy that generals thought would take months happened in weeks. But the invention had unintended consequences that nobody saw coming. The hedgerow cutters were so effective that soldiers started finding other uses for them. Tank crews discovered they could use them to smash through brick walls in French villages. They used them to push disabled vehicles off roads. Some crews even used them to clear snow or create river crossing points by knocking down trees. The device became a multi-purpose tool that nobody had planned for. Engineers started requesting them for non-combat uses. But there was a darker side to the success. With the hedgerow problem solved, commanders became overconfident. They started ordering attacks that would have been considered suicidal weeks earlier, assuming the Culin cutters made everything safe. They didn't. They just made hedgerows less deadly. Germans still had artillery, still had panzers, still had infantry with Panzerfausts. Some historians argue that the rapid advance the cutters enabled actually caused preventable casualties because supply lines couldn't keep up with the speed of the offensive. Units were running out of fuel and ammunition miles ahead of where they were supposed to be and getting ambushed as a result. And Culin himself? He didn't get to enjoy his hero status for long,